I'm Debra Sloan, and I'm a ceramicist and have been full-time ceramicist since 1973. And I started as a potter in 1968 as a student at the old Ross Hughey School in Vancouver. And full-time went at it in 1973 when my mother and I purchased a pottery school. And that's where I self-apprenticed for 6 years, sort of figuring out all the aspects of ceramics while running the school. And proceeded to have some shows at the House of Ceramics. And then finally, after we shut the school down, I attended the old Vancouver School of Art. And then it moved to Granville Island as sort of Emily Carr. And I graduated there in '82. And then I proceeded to build a studio and have worked in that studio since 1982 at my home. It's my double-car garage. And I had 4 kids in 3.5 years between 1985 and 1989. And started teaching again. I had been teaching, by the way, all the way through this. And started teaching again in 1991. I helped establish a sculptural program at the Shadbolt Center for the Arts. And I taught there for 21 years, and then at nights, and held some classes in my home and did all that kind of thing and carried on with exhibiting. I also participated in the community. I've been on the boards ever since probably 1979 or so. I've been on the Potters Guild board, the Craft Council board, and currently I'm president of the Northwest Ceramics Foundation. And I've been very involved in the history of ceramics in British Columbia, as it is a new culture. The Indigenous were masters of wood, but they never used clay and or developed a clay culture. So all the clay culture that's in Vancouver or in British Columbia has been imported through non-Indigenous people, mainly from Europe and Eastern Canada, and some from the States, and eventually from Asia. But it's almost a completely imported, it is an imported knowledge. So which makes it a very interesting tracker of how the culture evolved in, art culture evolved in British Columbia from 1900s. The very first people would have been probably China painters in Victoria, and then Emily Carr did some really bad ceramics, and then in the 1910s or so, and then the very first true ceramicist was a man named Axel Ebring, who emigrated eventually from Sweden. He came from a pottery family, so he actually had knowledge. A cranky old guy, and he went up to Vernon and lived by himself. But he did have a wonderful pottery, and his pottery is very, very collectible now. And then after that, it was various English, Eastern Canadians, coming from Ontario largely, and a few Americans who established ceramics slowly. In the 1950s, Robert Wagstein came from Belgium, and he was a foundation teacher at the Vancouver School of Art in the 50s, and he trained many of the people that we know today, like Tam Irving and Wayne Yan and people like that, took his classes. So it's a very interesting thing to study. I collect information about it. I collaborate with other collectors and other historians, and we're just trying to gather information at this point. And the archives for this are all held at the Craft Council. There's 13 boxes up in the attic at the Craft Council that I've stashed up there. Yeah, so anyways, that's really part of my practice. And it's really because it's such a new art culture in this region, it's part of understanding and learning about it. I don't know if I'd use the word inspire as much as one just needs to do it. You just do it. It's just been a way of living and being myself. I hate to say that, but it's just what I'm driven to do. So, but what engendered this piece was I'd been at the Museum of Anthropology for a year doing a residency, and one of the things I did was a plate of Adam and Eve. And the story of Adam and Eve has always irritated me immensely, because Eve has been holding the bag, well, for millennia. And that's not the only story. I mean, many cultures have the same story where the woman is held accountable for the sins of man, so to speak. Anyways, so when I was in Japan, I decided that I learned that in Nagano, there's a prefecture, they have little stone sculptures at the front of a village, and they're not very large. I think they're only about 3 feet or 2 feet, and they're a relief carving, and they're always of a man and a woman of equal size. And sometimes it's slightly sexual, sometimes it's not, but they're always holding hands or in some kind of contact with each other, very close side by side. And they are guardians to the village, and guardians to travelers on the road. So you'll find these little rocks, so, as you know, these are quite old, these little, and they're called Dosojins. But it's a male and female image in Japan, which has a completely different notion of sin and wrongness than the European idea. And so I just sort of tried to blend the two notions. And the apples, of course, come from the Garden of Eden. But this is a little tribute to Gathy Falk, the stacked apples. She didn't have leaves, but still, she did stack her fruit. So, and this is a shigaraki clay that comes naturally with these metal flecks in it, and came naturally pink. It's a very weird color, which I kind of liked. Well, ceramics is a community practice, and it's so I very much feel that the community has supported me, and all of us, we support each other, and because we try to have group shows, we have group sales, we share information through our newsletters. So I very much am affected by my community, and it's very much an important part of how I act as an artist in helping build community. Historic knowledge, I would say, is more to do with any ceramicist is inevitably affected by the history of ceramics, and now we have access to every single cultural form of ceramics. We can just internet it and find it. So our work is deeply, I would think most people are affected by historic ceramics. I wouldn't think tradition, except perhaps in some technical aspects. I would say just simply even the word processor has influenced me hugely, because all of a sudden I could do some writing and I could backspace and I could move paragraphs and arrange my ideas. So the first effect of new technology, and I consider the word processor new technology because I learned on a typewriter, really changed things and opened up the idea of writing, because I do quite a bit of writing as well. So about history of ceramics or certain artists, I like to find historic figures and write about them and how they fit into BC ceramic culture. So that was the first thing that really affected me. And then, of course, just being able to communicate through, and I largely use Facebook. Instagram's too time consuming. So I'm very much on the fringe of that. I have not used computer-generated images. I have thought about, some of my pieces have thought about, and perhaps will, approach some kind of way of making molds through a digital program, and figuring out whether I transfer the material or not. So that's in my mind, but I haven't done it. Well, I was raised middle class, so that made everything possible. You know, education, access, attitude. So that affects certainly how you can go forward, or it eases the path compared to a person who has to fight their way through economic, problems and maybe even parental discouragement. So I didn't have to deal with that. I just was able to proceed with ideas. And you don't make any money as a ceramicist, so you do just live simply. I mean, you just make that decision. So the community, in that sense, has been difficult in that culturally, Vancouver does not support the arts very well. They support it to a little degree, but not the way, probably in Canada, we are the least supported by our community as collectors, buyers, people who will probably spend more money on skiing, sailing, going, hiking, and not worry about the interior of their homes as much because they're outdoors so much compared to people in Alberta who collect more and people back east who collect more. So in that sense, the community, that's part of why I work at collecting the history and everything, is to try and get the community, the larger community, involved in understanding how our ceramic culture is part of the community and should be supported and acknowledged. And I know I'm saying ceramic all the time, but of course it includes all crafts, because weavers and everybody else have the same problem. Well, the materials here came from Japan, and some of the notions came from Japan. And then the ideas, like the idea of Adam and Eve, come from my own culture. And then I borrowed the idea of the Japanese Dosojins. So, but that is BC telephone wire, their hair. And some of the imagery came from British Columbia. So for me, it was like a journey between two cultures and the tradition, I should say, of Adam and Eve, and the tradition of Dosojins. So it was a sort of a blending. That's a very difficult question to actually know any kind of answer, except that people like Amy Gogarty, who's also got to work here, and whose piece has a cabbage in it, which is also a tribute to Gathy Falk. She comes from the States and then up to the prairies. And I was talking to Barbara Tipton, who's another well-known ceramicist from the prairies, and they said when they came to BC, they didn't recognize the aesthetic. It was so different from their aesthetic. And I know, again, that would be true of Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia and the East Coast, that we do have some kind of aesthetic that is ours, but I wouldn't be able to define it. And there was an essay written in 1989 by Glenn Allison and James Thornsbury, and they were given a grant by the Potters Guild of BC to try and find that aesthetic identity. And they also just sort of said they can't put their finger on it. And it's very hard to define. Like, you can't say, oh, we do tin glaze because of our materials, and we do this kind of decoration because of the tradition from floral painting or something, because everything's imported from all over the world. So somehow it's getting all mixed up in BC, but BC has a very different identity from the west of Canada. I mean, we're also quite cut off. With the Rocky Mountains, it is a sort of a real mental cut, in the sense of being on the outside. So there is something, but I couldn't tell you what it is. Oh, I just think it's been a very interesting exhibition because I didn't know the curator. I didn't know who was involved, and it was blind apparently. So what I was looking forward to seeing was how somebody from outside, and again, she's from the prairies, how she would look at the British Columbian craft. And what also is really interesting is that the Vancouver Art Gallery has a huge exhibition of historic craft. And I really would like to see somebody write about how they see the differences between these two exhibitions, and how craft is treated, and all that kind of information. So